have time for a few questions.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Gabriel. I'm a master's student here as well. I have a question first concerning Professor Mariana debate, and then concerning also what Professor Ari told us and what Professor Viviani told us a little bit about corporations and the securities market. It seems to me that we do have a corporation in Brazil, but actually we do have different regimes for very big and publicly traded corporations and small or medium-sized corporations. Because as far as I can see, those really big corporations, they do have a legal personality. So there's much, I don't see the courts taking this, I don't see the possibility of a partial dissolution, as well as I don't see the possibility of shareholders and the board being responsible for companies' acts. So my question is it true? Is it true that, can we say that we do have two different regimes for corporations when one, which is big, is truly a corporation, the other small ones are much more like a limitada, a limited liability company, as we have in Brazil?
Okay, so thanks, Gabriel. That's a great question. So to what extent what I'm describing here is special to closed corporations, and then you have just the regular business corporation when it comes to publicly traded firms. We have few of them. Yeah, so we had a boom before, but now many are delisting. So, you know, it's still possibly quite something if we only have the corporate attributes in the publicly traded firms. So there are two things I want to say about that. You're right that we have no cases of partial dissolution involving publicly traded corporations, although there are some scholars who defend that for publicly traded corporations whose shares lack liquidity, the same rationale should apply. It hasn't been tested yet. I know of no cases testing this theory. Concerning limited liability, in fact, we have only one case in which a shareholder of a publicly traded corporation that when bust was held liable. That was the case of Incol, and that was the case of a shareholder who had been a former officer. But still, we have that. And we also have the perception that, you know, of the law of financial institutions, or biggest financial institutions, are publicly traded firms. And the general perception is that the law says that, you know, they're probably too big to fail. But there is this fear that limited liability applies to them. So when there was the 2008 financial crisis, the controlling shareholder of a big Brazilian investment bank gave an interview to the Financial Times saying, well, you know, Brazil is different because if my bank goes bust, they take my house. You know, that's inaccurate. They take everything according to the law except for his house, which has homestead protection. But this is the perception. So I think it has a slightly more limited application to publicly traded corporations, but some part of the pattern is still present. But then I wanted to engage with your second observation, which is that, well, closed corporations are like limitadas. And for limitadas in Brazil, we've long, perhaps always, had the regime that shareholders could, in practice, force a partial dissolution. Lock-in was unavailable. And this is like a natural fact of life in Brazil. No one questions the lack of lock-in with respect to limitada. And it was actually a great surprise to me when I found that with respect to other countries, the equivalent in other countries to the Brazilian limitada, those entities actually have lock-in. So in fact, the elimination of lock-in that we first saw long ago with respect to the Brazilian limitada was also a deviation from a comparative perspective. So which is also interesting and puzzling to me.
Well, again, we have another research, and just to know reality about limitadas. And, well, limitadas in Brazil is different from a company limited by shares, has nothing to do. We just research all companies limitadas register at the State of São Paulo Public Register. And what we found was that most of those limitadas, they are very small companies between husband and wife, between brothers, or between two partners that don't care about law. And why or how we perceive that they don't care about law? Because by Brazilian law at least, companies must have at least two partners. And we found quite a lot of companies whose the husband or the wife or the brother died, and the company has been running, selling, buying, issuing receipts and so on, just with one partner. So our conclusion is not theoretical. Our conclusion is that the legislation concerning the limitadas in the Brazil Civil Code that requires quorums, meetings, quoting to call for meetings, publishing paper, newspaper, and so on, is crazy. And the project of commercial code transform a little bit what is in civil code. But to my taste, and based on that research, I would go straight back to the company law at the beginning of the 20th century that works quite well because it is concerned only with small issues, small companies, companies that have one or two partners, usually family partners, a small business. So that's quite easy to do. Just forget about the civil code, goes back to the legislation in the beginning of the 20th century. The real problem is how, if we want or if we are able to create a securities market to finance the industry, commerce, service of this country. That's a real problem that I would like to have David at my side to find out solutions.
Fiscal incentive. Fiscal incentive.
I have a question for you, Sergio. We have a long debate on this issue, state versus market in corporate finance in Brazil. So your claim is basically that the state-owned banks, and in particular BNDES, crowds out the market space and the market alternative for corporate finance. And usually my reaction is that the state-owned banks are a sort of second best, not exactly for the market failures, but for the institutional failures. It is a sort of Oliver Hart claim in the tropics. And then we had this debate in the newspaper, and where your co-authors claim were that the egg or the chicken which came first. So if market failures or the crowding out of BNDES, and then I asked you about the Henry, so the institutional arrangement. And your reaction to my proposition of market or institutional failure is that in the past we had another example of institutional arrangement in which the market-oriented institutions worked. So it is possible to rebuild this institutional pattern of organization and avoiding this hard problem and thus configuring a true economic market capitalism in Brazil. But my question here is how and this argument is basically, as you told us some minutes ago, is based on the Aldo Mozacchio's book on the line finance in Brazil in the 19th century, which is an amazing book, by the way. But going into this argument, my question here is, how realistic is this claim about the 19th century legal institutions if we are in a new kind of capitalism now? And if I understood correctly the argument by Mozacchio, he is testing there the claim by Regent and Zingales, the Great Reversal. And basically this claim is that in the First War, several countries suffered a great reversal in their market economy institutions, and Brazil did the same. So we shift from the market institutions to state institutions, and then we have this path dependence trajectory in the state pathway. So my question here is, if we had this great reversal and after this we had a new kind of capitalism, how realistic is this counter example of the 19th century for today?
So we continue our exchanges here. So we continue our exchanges, us.
Sure.
So that's good.
And I ask you to present here an argument against my point of view. So it's a very honest exchange of ideas.
Yeah, that's right. So, okay, I think we need a reversal of the Great Reversal. And I think it's doable. Let me explain why. Very practical example. In 2013, I was coming back from Rio, and then I met one CEO of a big private equity fund. And the guy was interested in investing in airports. You remember that the government was trying to privatize airports, etc. And the guy apparently was really angry at me. He pushed me like this and said, "Sergio, you are being really critic of BNDES. We really need this bank because we are in an institutional condition where we cannot raise really capital, etc., etc., etc." And then I replied to him saying, you know, just a moment. Consider this project you are trying to invest in, which is an airport. And by the way, this airport is already built. You don't need to really rebuild the airport. It's just a matter of going there. You go there, you refurbish the airport, and then you lease part of the space to I don't know, to McDonald's, if you will. So anyway, so you get money, and in the case of airports, you have a flow of tariffs that will come, so you can give those tariffs as guarantees, just like an example that I gave you, the port, same thing. And the guy was agreeing with me. The guy was saying, "Oh, yeah." And I said, furthermore, this airport is a private monopoly. It's in Rio, actually. I didn't, sorry for that. It was a privatization of an airport in Rio, Galeão. And the guy was agreeing with me. So I was basically saying, giving him arguments that he could could have raised this capital in the private markets, perhaps with corporate bonds. The guy was agreeing with me, and then I said, so why you're saying that you need to go to this state-owned bank and get the money? And the guy said, because the government intervenes in our prices, because there's huge volatility. So you notice, it's nothing related to our historical stock of institutions. It's a bunch of policies that were misguided and increased the perceived risk of private investment. So that's why I think we can move and have some changes in institutions, marginal perhaps, to improve this kind of perceived risk and encourage more private capital.
So my questions to Professor Sergio as well. My name is Bruno. I am a master candidate here, and as a matter of fact, I studied the airports. But my question, I was sparked by Professor Mario's comments, and I was thinking if you could comment maybe on how the new TLP, just approved, could help this crowding out effect of BNDES, especially in what regards the infrastructure projects.
Well, it's a huge fight. There was a huge fight. I participated in some of those discussions about, actually, we are in an effort to to reduce implicit subsidies, right, in those prices or interest rates that are set by the government, and leave it more explicit through, we hope, discussions in our with our deputies in our Congress, etc., more explicit discussion about the allocation of incentives. So in a sense, I think it is good. One question is whether, in discussions with industrialists and businessmen all the time, they criticize me and say, but we are not going to get money to invest, etc., etc., etc. But actually, what we are seeing is that those changes, those institutional changes, they are reducing the perceptions about the risk of intervention, the risk of excessive public expenses, etc., creating several types of macroeconomic risk. It seems that they are improving the business climate, right? So, and over time, we expect that this will be reflected. Those marginal institutional improvements, we hope, will be reflected in the big prices that we have in our economy, including our interest rates. And those rates, we hope, will reduce and encourage more investment. And even more, I don't know, then if we had those subsidies, implicit subsidy structures in place. Having said that, I do not defend the complete elimination of subsidies or the state-owned banks. By the way, I study state-owned enterprises, right? Sometimes I'm called the statist because sometimes I defend state-owned enterprise because I'm in discussions like we need to privatize everything, and then I said no. I mean there is room for state-owned firms, etc. So what you need to do is precisely to leave improve those micro institutions to attract private capital in easier projects, right? That it can be orchestrated with private capital, like airports, this private port, many other examples, and leave the state capital, subsidized rates, etc., to projects that we know will generate more externalities, more impact, etc. I'm talking about small and medium-sized enterprises that have good projects, right? Innovation projects, all those things we know that, and going back, I forgot to mention HART, Mario. So HART's theory is essentially that you have state presence when you cannot write complete contracts, between two private parties, and therefore a private operator or executor will neglect certain social dimensions. So anyway, so we should leave exactly state participation to those more complicated conditions, not an airport, right, or an existing airport, in my opinion.
Okay, thank you all.